Welcome to this next video and the second half, the history of the Roman Republic, involving the struggle of the lower classes and eventual power squabble that resulted in the empire. Throughout this period of Roman history, since there were no more national enemies on Rome's border that were a threat to her existence, much of the contention within Rome became internal, struggling to correct the societal injustices inherent in the republican system of government. Whenever you see a blue trapezoid, like these up here, that will represent a festering injustice that will spark the problem that is next to it. Whenever you see a orange-beige star, that will represent a new and unprecedented act of audacity, or effrontery, that marked Rome's gradual decline from civil and polite republican debate and governance into raw, cutthroat, power-hungry power plays that ultimately resulted in the single strongman emperor of the empire. The beginning of this phase of Roman history starts with the end of the Carthaginian Wars. In the First Carthaginian War, Rome had obtained the islands in the Mediterranean. In the Second Carthaginian War, Rome had outflanked Hannibal and neutralized Carthage, giving it a peace treaty that would ensure that it was never a power ever again. In the Third Carthaginian War, Rome simply laid siege to it, wiped Carthage off the map, sowed salt into the fields, and proclaimed public curses against any people to ever found a city there again, although those very Romans would come and settle a colony there within a single generation. The result of this was twofold. One was that many slaves were imported into rich people's estates, principally in Sicily and southern Italy. And the other thing was that, just as had happened for Carthage after the First Carthaginian War, many veterans came streaming home to Rome. However, unlike in the Carthaginian case, these veterans were not seeking pay. They had fought only for Rome, for loyalty to their ancestors, and they were not in any way going to fight against it. In fact, they were quite humble, and pretty soon they formed large masses of gypsy-like travelers that would move across the countryside of the Italian peninsula from place to place, seeking temporary work wherever they could find it. Around this time, two plebeian tribunes observed the condition of the veterans and publicly lamented in the Senate and in other places what a tragedy it was that these men who had given their lives, and in some cases received wounds for the cause of Rome, were now left bereft of any land, without any land or place to call their own, or to erect a monument to their ancestors or to their posterity. These two famous tribunes who had taken up the cause of land reform were two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, each of whom died 10 years apart, one being older and therefore having an earlier political career than the other. The two brothers each championed the cause of land reform that had been created by the injustice of the upper class's land grabbing. In fact, this practice ignited this whole phase of struggle of the lower classes, causing all three of the injustices of this age that would spark various lower-class rebellions. There were three such lower-class rebellions, and in all three, the lower class basically achieved, or enabled itself to achieve, its goal. These three lower classes were the slaves, the Italian allies, and the plebes. The two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, were plebeian tribunes. The plebeian tribune office had been created centuries earlier when the plebeians had threatened to leave the republic and had insisted that an office of a tribune be made, and that office have a power of veto, so that the tribune could walk into any governmental function or assembly or action and call veto and force it to stop. Now, in the early centuries, this veto was used rarely, only against the most flagrant and awful of the upper class's laws. But when it came to Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus's time, these two brothers considered that land reform had become such an awful problem that they were going to use not as a defense, but as a weapon. Therefore, the Gracchi brothers adopted the practice of using the veto to stop not just one or a few things, but all functioning of the Roman government within the city of Rome. Wherever the Senate or any public meeting was going to be held, there were the two brothers vetoing the assembly, insisting that they would not cease to veto until land reform was dealt with. The result of this was swift and sudden, in an audacious thing not seen for centuries in Rome. Both brothers, first one, then the other, were assassinated by the upper classes in public brawls, first with clubs and later with professional archers. This sent a solid and scary message to the lower classes that attempts to change the system of senatorial land grabbing would not be tolerated. This system had developed over the years, whereby public lands, once conquered from other cities and nations, could be easily redistributed to members of the Senate, who were themselves the government. Therefore, as time went on throughout Roman history, Roman senators tended to accumulate vast tracts of formerly public land in the Italian peninsula. Multiple ancient literary sources describe certain rich Romans bragging that they could walk from one end of Italy to the other on land personally owned by them, which they had never seen in their entire life, but whose fruits, products, and profit was merely poured into their coffers once it was sold by the various merchants and overseers in those locations. This flagrant injustice of vast estates and senatorial land tracts was exacerbated by the influx of many slaves from the Carthaginian Wars, and created three Servile Wars, servile from the word slave, of which the third Servile War was the greatest and was led by the Thracian nobleman, then a gladiator, after he had been captured and enslaved, named Spartacus. The story of Spartacus is that he was a gladiator at a gladiatorial school in Capua, Italy, in the south of Italy, and they revolted against their master and found a cache of Roman weapons, and then went and hid themselves in the caldera of Mount Vesuvius. When the local Roman garrison came out to block the only entrance to the crater, they used vines to slip down the backside of the mountain and slipped away to the south of Italy. Going from rich latifundia, which is the word for rich estate or wide estate, from latifundia to latifundia, they took all the slaves as they went and accumulated a vast mass of self-freeing slaves and gladiators heading along the coast and around the peninsula of Italy. At this time in Roman history, there were not powerful commanders in charge of the Roman army, so the Republic did not respond to this threat very quickly. In fact, as was common of the Republic, the debates over who should put down the rebellion and how they should do it and how it should be financed pretty much enabled the gladiators to get away without even being contested. And pretty soon they were heading north straight out of Italy, back presumably to their homelands from where they had come, either from Gaul, where Caesar's Gallic Wars had captured most of them, or from Thrace, where many of them, like Spartacus, had been equally captured. However, as is typical of this era of Roman history, they decided that life in Italy would be far better than returning home, and presumed, arrogantly, that they were strong enough to capture land in Italy and hold it. Therefore, as is common during all wars in this era, once Rome has now become the main power in the Mediterranean, the focus was no longer on the frontiers, but now on Rome itself. Marching back into Italy, they were this time taken seriously by the Roman Republic and met by two famous men who would later become members of the First Triumvirate. And the gladiators were trapped and annihilated here in the south of Italy as they were trying to cross into Sicily. And by the way, those two generals were Pompey and Crassus, who wiped them out. Nevertheless, the three Servile Wars were a sign of the grave injustices that were creating problems now in the Italian peninsula. Now, a few popcorn rebellions popped up in the meantime, and these two showed the ineffectiveness of the Republic in responding to an emergency. The first such popcorn rebellion was the Cimbri and Teutones, who were a warring tribe coming out of Scandinavia and the Jutland Peninsula, and who for several years ran rampant over Europe, both in non-Roman Europe up in Gaul and in Roman Europe down in Spain. In fact, when the Senate finally sent two consuls after them, the two consuls were personally at enmity with one another and would not cooperate and defend one another. And the result of that was that at the Battle of Arausio, the Cimbri and Teutones wiped out first one consular army, and then crossed the river and wiped out the other consular army, resulting in the greatest Roman slaughter in history, 80,000 dead. However, like all wild and uncontrolled mobs of barbarians, they ultimately dwindled in number and were soon wiped out by the next wave of Roman generals who were sent up to meet them. Back to the struggle of the classes. The next two big famous persons to come on the stage are two leaders who first appear in a war and in another popcorn rebellion in Numidia. And these two leaders at first cooperated with one another. They were Marius and his lieutenant, Sulla. Now, Marius was a great reformer. He was loved by the lower classes, and he was perhaps Rome's most effective general in history. Marius, if you see this thought bubble here, which we used in the earlier slides, for good ideas and advancements as Rome was slowly coming to its ascendancy and slowly growing in effectiveness in his army, Marius put the icing on the cake concerning the Roman army. The Marian reforms turned Rome's army from an amateur patchwork quilt volunteer army to now a truly professional, regularized army where everything from the least to the greatest aspect of military life was highly regulated and standardized. And so we should look at what these four reforms were. The first and the most important reform was that he replaced the maniple with the legion. Now, if you remember from the previous videos, originally Rome had a phalanx, and then in the interest of maneuverability, they had switched to a maniple, which was a checkered board formation, in which each checker could move around without being inhibited by a broad line of troops blocking its way. But with Marius's reforms, Marius again switched the army back to the heavy block of troops, now called a legion. A legion was composed of, you can count the columns, count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 cohorts, each containing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 centuries. So the effect of this Marian reform was that now the army was coming back under the control of a commander. The maniple was best suited for control at the local level by the local commanders of each checker or maniple unit. But with the legion now, the design was so that one single commander could put up legion next to legion next to legion, creating a huge battle line. So that was the first Marian reform. The next and almost equally important reform of Marius was that he standardized the equipment. Up to this time, the soldiers had to buy their own equipment, and that meant that the poor could not be soldiers, which is a surprise, actually, because that means that Rome conquered the whole world based on a volunteer army, where people had to buy their own equipment just to get into the army and risk their lives. But now Marius enabled the poor to be in the legion too, because from now on the government supplied a standardized set of armor and weapons to every single soldier. This was actually a great blessing to the Roman Republic, because the existence of the broad latifundia throughout Italy had created a great number of idle plebeians who had nothing to do and were starting to agitate for free bread. However, with the opening of the army to the poor, This suddenly became a viable valve to release the pressure on the poor and enable them to obtain a measure of upward mobility in the army. Now the poor could enter into the army for 20 or 30 years, and at the end they would receive a tract of land, which was Marius's third reform, as well as a sum of money, thereby enabling them to become legit Roman citizens rather than just the riffraff that they had been inside the vast city of Rome. Marius's final reform was actually arguably the downfall, ultimately, of the entire Roman Empire. Previously, the Roman armies had been paid out of the Senate treasury. Now, however, Marius switched the situation, causing generals themselves to pay the army. This created a double effect. One was that generals would have to tax the provinces excessively in order to get enough money to pay their armies. The other result was that soldiers would now become personally loyal to their own general, thereby enabling this power squabbles of emperor against emperor in the later empire. So, turning over the power of the purse from the Senate into the hands of commanders is ultimately what led to the empire and to the downfall of the empire in the centuries later. In any case, however, for the moment, the Marian reforms were excellent reforms and greatly improved the effectiveness of the Roman army, so that in the decades after that, random senators could then be picked as legates or legion commanders or even governors in charge of several legions, and without any military experience, except for some of them a few years as a tribune, could command Roman armies effectively in the field because the army itself knew what to do, even if the general didn't. So from this point on, generals would just see to the large-scale tactics, leaving all the details to the honed system that had been established by Marius's reforms. Next on the list is the social war. All right, what is that? This is the next group of lower class revolting. Who are the socii? Socii is a Latin term for your associates or your allies. So the social war was a result of all the Italian city-states feeling discontent at being encroached upon by the rich people's estates. What was supposed to happen in theory was that local Italian tribes were supposed to have certain lands that they had been granted from time immemorial when they had been absorbed into the Republic. However, the effect of the greed of the senators was encroaching upon these lands, causing additionally large numbers of Italians in their outlying towns to look across the fence and see these broad and empty estates that they very much would like to farm. Meanwhile, they were being confined and crushed into very smaller and smaller farms by their own population growth. The socii, or allies, therefore, revolted in the Great Social War of 91 to 88 and basically drove Rome up to their own wall. The Romans had their backs to the wall, and although the Romans ended up beating the Italian allies, nevertheless, the Italian allies accomplished their objective, because immediately following that, Julius Caesar down here instituted what was called the Lex Julia, after his first name, which gave those Italian allies citizenship and enabled them to have larger tracts of land. After surviving this popcorn rebellion by the allies, a third popcorn rebellion occurred out in Pontus, which is an area in northeast Anatolia. And while the Romans were deciding who should command the army, they got in a fight between the two classes. The upper class, or optimates, wanted to support Sulla and elect him to be the general. The lower classes wanted Marius to be the general. And in a strange incident, the Senate elected Sulla, while the popular assembly elected Marius. Sulla, being faster, raced out to the army waiting for him and won it over to his allegiance. And then in one of the great impieties and acts of audacity in Roman history, he marched on Rome and marched against his own previous commander, Marius. In fact, he took Marius completely by surprise because this was something that had never happened in history, that an army would actually march on Rome and seize the power, seize the Senate and the popular assembly, and rule by royal fiat. And that is actually exactly what Sulla did. Before he went out to fight the Pontus, he invaded Rome, and Marius was caught by surprise and tried to organize some defenses in the city amongst the gladiators, but it was completely too late and too little, and Marius had to flee the situation and go south to Africa, where he had friendly allies and was able to pass the time in exile. Sulla, having achieved his objectives of dictating policy at the point of a sword, turned around and went back to his assigned objective of conquering King Mithridates out there in Pontus, and did that and became the governor out there in Pontus. So Sulla was gone for the moment. Once Sulla was gone, Marius came straight back and returned an eye for an eye. Where Sulla had killed or purged several of Marius's supporters, Marius did the same thing to Sulla's supporters. And in fact, Marius turned it into a bloodbath. And thus became the lamentable Roman practice of proscription, from the word scribo, to write, and forth, to write forth the names of the people you wanted killed. In other words, to make a hit list. And this lamentable practice became a commonplace occurrence in the next 30 years following, leading instantly to the fall of the dialoguers and debaters like Cicero, and instead replacing them with the cutthroat politics of people like Caesar and Mark Antony, who were willing to proscribe all their enemies and seize power totally without any mercy upon their opponents. Although Caesar himself had some mercy. But in any case, the return of Marius to Rome marked the first time that proscription really happened in earnest. It was said that if Marius didn't respond to your hello, you were likely to be dead within a week. And the whole population of Rome suddenly was immersed in fear of the mobs of hitmen created by Marius and his soldiers. Well, phase 1 had been Sulla knocking off people. Now phase 2 had been Marius knocking off people. Once again in phase 3, Sulla came roaring back, and Marius happened to die just in time of natural causes. And Sulla therefore knocked off Marius' son, drove out his army. In any case, Sulla retained power again, and now Sulla did a third purge, purging out all the Marian supporters, killing all them off. So in the awful civil war here, we saw a triple bloodbath purge. First, the populares being killed by Sulla, then the optimates being killed by Marius, and then the populares being killed by Sulla. This war would set a precedent for history, and from now on, although the Senate would debate within reason, there was always a sense in the Senate that there were certain things you didn't say, and a cloud of fear hung over the Senate, so that for all practical purposes, the new power broker in the region was the nearest general or army commander. Thus ended the second struggle of the lower classes. The populares, through this civil war, thereby showed the upper classes that they could exert purges, and the result of this was the appearance of a new player in Roman politics, the mob. And the mob would directly elect or choose by public acclamation 3 men who would claim that they would stop the bloodbath jointly. These 3 men were Pompey, who was a general under Sulla out in Pontus there. Actually, I'm not sure Pompey was under Sulla. I think he was, but I might be wrong about that. Caesar, who had kind of the support of the upper classes at first, and Crassus, who was the man with money. Caesar was really the politician. He knew how to give speeches and wield authority at first. So basically, you had a three-way joining of a general, a politician, and a banker to end the Roman Republic and rule together jointly by royal fiat. The machinery of the Republic, in terms of its offices and seniority system, still remained in place, but the central decisions were now being made by the three Triumvirs, not by the Senate. This signaled the end of the Republic. In fact, there was a noteworthy changeover where Caesar, becoming consul, demanded land reform as the Gracchi brothers had originally advocated and as Marius had advocated, and basically as all the lower-class populares leaders had advocated. And when the Senate, which was full of rich people, wouldn't do it, Caesar grabbed the arms of Pompey and Crassus and proceeded out of the Senate house into the forum, onto the rostra, which was in front of the Senate house, and standing on the rostra there, proclaimed to the people that the Senate had rejected his land reform and asked them if they supported it. And the people, the mob, yelled back, "Yes, we support it." Whereupon Caesar asked, "Will you support it with arms?" To which they responded that they would. To which Pompey himself responded that he would join their arms not only with swords but with shields as well, implying that Pompey would bring his own army right up to the gates of Rome, just as Marius and Sulla had each done. And that was basically the end of the Senate. In fact, the Senate ceased to meet as of that point and would only meet intermittently in the years that would follow. So the deposing of the Senate was the final straw to the end of the Republic. No longer would public dialogue and deliberation be the deciding factor in Roman policy. Now it would be the cutthroat, personally biased decision of the Roman commander, whoever was in charge of the army. Thus entered on the next phase of Roman history, the power squabble. Because any time a house is divided against itself, it cannot stand. And so this next phase in Roman history will see the, at first, joint ruling, but ultimately civil war between the members of the triumvirates that will occur, of which there will be two triumvirates, the first triumvirate and the second triumvirate. By the way, triumvirate means 3 men, for 3 men ruling jointly. So we've seen the first triumvirate so far of Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. Crassus, on the right here, would soon die at the Battle of Carrhae, fighting the Parthians far away and off on the borders of Persia in the desert, where the Roman army was basically shot to death by horse archers, the forerunners of the Arabian Islamic conquest, but not for another 700 years. So with Crassus out of the picture, the only 2 players left were Caesar and Pompey, who were friends at first and cooperated jointly. Indeed, Pompey made Caesar general of Gaul and looked aside as Caesar slowly accumulated more and more legions up there in Gaul, as Caesar would get experience and glory waging his Gallic wars. And that is the next great event in Roman history, which is the Gallic Wars of Caesar up there in Gaul. Now, this phase of Roman history is normally studied, and I won't cover it too much because it will be studied in later years of your studies. But what it boiled down to was Caesar being a local legionary commander, a local governor, and like other governors, he would effectively squash the local rebellions. But unlike other governors, he would also mount a propaganda campaign, namely the writings of his Gallic Wars, which, although read today, were at that time sent back to Rome and read frequently in Rome to let the local populace know how the war was turning out. So they were kind of like news dispatches. By sending back these correspondence to Rome, Caesar was able to frequently complain that, oh, we need more legions out here, we need more legions out here. For this and that, and he would let them know what glorious victories they were achieving and how none of the legionaries were dying and they were killing hundreds of thousands of Gauls in every miraculous battle. Caesar probably inflated the numbers to make himself look good. But in any case, the story of the 10 years of Caesar here in Gaul are his army going round and round, and even once and twice into Britain, to basically pacify the huge Celtic culture that for centuries had been warring across the hill countries of France. By the time the 10 years were up, Caesar had added the single greatest expansion of Roman land to Rome in history, and had become the greatest hero and general in history, greater even than Pompey, who in the Triumvirate had been considered the general owing to Pompey's conquests out east in Pontus. So here again, though, we see the problem of the Roman Republic. And one of the problems of the Roman Republic, one of the injustices, which I forgot to put here and which I'll put here now, was that the court system had become corrupt. And that was that any time a governor would return from governing a province, it had become the practice that his political enemies in Rome would automatically charge him with charges, because there was a misalignment between the official things which governors were allowed to do and the actual things which they would regularly do all the time in order to do things like get enough money to pay off their armies. So the result was that governors would frequently be tried the moment they returned to Rome. And in an effort to avoid that, they would try to prolong their stay out in the provinces and try to be instantly appointed to some other position, because they could not be tried as long as they were still in office. There was no such thing as impeachment, as we have in America. No, the only time that a person could be tried was the moment they stepped out of power. So when Caesar's term of office expired in Gaul, Caesar, seeking naturally to avoid prosecution by his enemies back in Rome for perfectly normal things that any governor would do, requested that he either get another promotion or that he be able to retain one legion, so that if he were tried and found guilty, he would not at least lose all his power and be exiled and maybe even assassinated. Well, that request was denied by Pompey, his previous friend. Caesar then, wishing to bargain, then took one out of his 10 legions and crossed this river here, which was the official border of Italy. Now, this was a great act of boldness, because one was not supposed to take an army into Italy. After Sulla and Marius's march on Rome, it was now official that no general was supposed to take an army into Italy. Well, Caesar thought very hard about this decision to take one army with him in order to go negotiate with Pompey in Rome. And when he crossed the river, knowing that he had violated the law, he uttered this phrase, "The die is cast." And that resulted in, a civil war, but Caesar didn't intend that. In fact, Caesar went chasing Pompey all the way to the tip of Italy. Along the whole way, Caesar had his one legion with him and was sending frequent letters to Pompey, "Please, stop panicking. Come talk with me. We can work this out." But Pompey, who was being egged on now by the upper classes, was playing it up as a state of emergency. In fact, the moment Caesar crossed the Rubicon, it was said that hundreds of noble families went streaming to Rome in utter uproar, even though Caesar hadn't really done any fighting at all and was just moving south, taking his army with him. Immediately, they made a mountain out of a molehill and proclaimed that there was a civil war and that everybody needed to go and defend their possessions and take to arms, etc., etc., etc. So, surprisingly, Caesar with his one legion avoided being surrounded and killed, because Caesar was that good of a commander. And Pompey found himself here at the tip of Italy with his senatorial friends, and nowhere to go, and had nothing to do but cross into Greece and basically start drawing legions from all around the Eastern Empire in an effort to, in his words, restore the republic against the tyrant that was Caesar. Now, admittedly, Caesar would become the future emperor, so this was the start of the empire. But for the moment, at least, Pompey was making a kind of a superfluous claim, because we can remember that Pompey had been one of those 3 members of the Triumvirate who had himself deposed the Senate and thereby ended the Republic. So it was kind of a cheap tactic that no one really believed, except those who wanted to believe it, namely the upper classes. So in any case, Caesar turned around, captured or conquered, or in most cases just won to his own allegiance, many of the Pompeian legions in Sicily and Spain, conquering the others, and then moved many of them across the Adriatic Sea until he could finally face off against Pompey here in Greece. And that face-off occurred at the Battle of Pharsalus, in which Caesar, just by superior generalmanship here in the blue, routed Pompey's army and basically sent Pompey fleeing on his horse to the tip of Greece and then to the eastern Mediterranean off to Egypt. So Pompey basically fled all the way down here to Egypt, and Caesar was the only triumvirate, the only person, the only power left standing. So Caesar went chasing Pompey, even now willing to negotiate with Pompey and willing to allow Pompey a measure of exile or retirement. But the local leader here in Egypt thought it would be a nice thing to present Caesar with Pompey's head. Which, when Caesar saw it, Caesar cried for his own friend, and Caesar promptly executed that leader, but in any case returned to Rome as the sole ruler and power. And so that was the end of the first triumvirate, with Caesar being the only one left standing. The key date to remember in all this is this year 44 BC. Caesar ruled for about a year or two, and then as he gradually accumulated more and more power and started to look more and more like a king, I think he even almost accepted a crown at one point, although I may be wrong. Eventually, Caesar was assassinated in 44 by the forces of the Republic. They saw in Caesar the old kings coming back, and they wanted to restore the old Republic, although the lower classes would probably see them as wanting to just restore the rich people. So depending on what side you're on, you would see them as Republicans or just the nobles. And so the result was that Caesar was himself assassinated in 44 BC, and his body was displayed in the forum, and the assassins told this next guy, Mark Antony, hey, you go make a speech telling people what a good thing we assassins have done for them to remove this tyrant Caesar from power. And Mark Antony uttered his famous, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears speech, and used tongue-in-cheek sarcasm to lampoon the assassins and pretend that he was defending the assassins, but by voice inflection let the crowd know that these assassins had done a really awful thing that was not in their favor at all. And so Mark Antony, therefore, became the new leader of the Roman mob, and he would remain that for the rest of his political career in Rome, at least until he departed for Egypt later on, many years later. So Mark Antony was the force of the people at this moment, and the assassins were terrified by the Roman mob and raced out of the city. And so this phase of Roman history will see constant attempts by the Republic to restore itself to power using the legions of the Eastern Roman Empire. However, they always fail, and they always lose in a glorious battle out here in Greece. And this time would be no exception. So the assassins of Caesar, who were principally Brutus, who had been Caesar's own adopted son, surprisingly, and another guy named Cassius, fled to the east and began collecting an army near Philippi, or Philippi, in northeastern Greece. And Mark Antony got into league with Caesar's official heir, who was this guy, Octavian, and the two of them got support of the local pontifex or priest, Marcus Lepidus, and they formed the Second Triumvirate. and they announced to the masses that they were going to go avenge Caesar's death, and that Caesar was a god and, deified him. And so they raised legions out of the masses of Rome and also out of Caesar's own previous legions, who had used to be allegiant to him. And so they went and met the Republicans in battle out here at Philippi. And it was a close-run battle. Octavian was driven out and beaten by Cassius, but Mark Antony beat Brutus. And so even though each side won one and lost one, nevertheless, Antony's victory over Brutus was more powerful because Antony managed to break Brutus's center. And so the result of that was that Brutus's army fled the battlefield and fled to the peaks of the mountains around about, where they had no water and were quickly surrounded and forced to surrender by the Triumvirate, by the forces of the soon-to-be empire. Okay, so that was the second attempt to restore republican government to Rome, which failed. You can use your own decision deciding how genuine these republicans were. If you read Cicero, you will find yourself sympathizing with republicans and seeing all these generals marching through here as illegal and against the republican form of government. However, if you read Caesar's writings, then you will see the republicans as mere pawns of the rich. And so, it depends whose version of history you prefer to read. But in any case, the result of Philippi was that the assassins were defeated. They committed suicide on the tops of those mountains, and the new power players were the Second Triumvirate: Octavian, Mark Antony, and Marcus Lepidus. And this triumvirate ruled for about 8 years. Marcus Lepidus died quickly, and the remaining two divided the empire up between the west and east. And Mark Antony, who was loved by the masses, should have picked the west, but he picked the rich east, where there was the sweet and enchanting and seductive Queen Cleopatra. And so, just as Caesar had taken up with Queen Cleopatra when he was chasing Pompey, so also Mark Antony fell into the lures and charms of Queen Cleopatra, and thereby fell out of favor with the Roman masses. No longer did they see him as a Roman, they saw him as a wannabe Easterner now, a wannabe Hellenistic guy, living it up, not in the rugged, rough, terse Roman Western, virtue, but now living it up in the riches of the East. And so the sympathy of the masses quickly shifted to being sympathetic toward Octavian, who had been Caesar's official heir. So that set up the third and final clash between East and West. So far we had Pharsalus to put Caesar in power, Philippi to avenge him out of power, and now in this third and final clash, there was a sea battle at Actium, which, if I make it big enough, you can see is on the west coast of Greece, just across the Adriatic from Brundisium, from the southern tip of Italy. And so Octavian would defeat Antony. Antony had the bigger ships, but Octavian's ships were more maneuverable. And although Antony was holding up pretty well against Octavian's assault, in the heat of battle, Cleopatra, with her reserve here, lost her nerve and went fleeing away with her barge and contingent of warships to the south. And Mark Antony, up here on the right, saw her going and himself went fleeing away. And you can imagine, once Mark Antony goes, all the other ships in his line immediately followed. And so suddenly you had a situation where Mark Antony's whole fleet is fleeing, strung out in a long line, and being chased by the faster ships of Octavius. And as you can imagine, without a doubt, Octavius's ships picked off Antony's ships one by one, so that basically they wiped out Antony's whole fleet. And once Antony and Cleopatra got back to Egypt, there was nothing to do but just man the trenches and try to defend against the inevitable arrival of Octavian's troops, which when they got there, Cleopatra committed suicide lest she be taken in a triumphal procession, and I forget what happened
To Antony.
I think he may have committed suicide also. So in any case, that was the end of the second triumvirate, and the only person left standing was Octavian, the adoptive son of the winner of the first triumvirate, namely Caesar, Julius Caesar. Okay, so you have two Caesars in history. Julius Caesar won the first triumvirate, and Augustus Caesar won the second triumvirate. And the ascendancy of Augustus Caesar marks the end of the Republic. He would be the first Roman emperor, and he would rule for a long 40 years, from 27 to 14. And his rule would be the most peaceful time period, and the Romans would see this as a wonderful, glorious time and would never go back to the Republic. Although the Republic would function in the service of the emperor, from now on, the emperor would possess all the official offices at the top of the Republic, like Pontifex Maximus, like consul, like tribune. And so the rest of the Republican system would just be a bureaucracy, which would be at the service of Caesar to help him administer the provinces. All right, I hope you enjoyed the second half of this video on the Roman Republic, and in the next video we will deal with the Empire.